I'll put it on you,
Devin Haney is too fast, too sharp, too experienced. Devin Haney pulled off the upset and defeated the undefeated power punching world champion Brian Norman Jr. by a unanimous decision. And the most shocking part of the fight was when the supposed pillow-fisted Devin Haney dropped Norman hard and had him very hurt in the second round. It was meant to be Brian Norman Jr.'s power that would be the problem here. You know, that big patented left hook of his, the one he scored the knockout of the decade with against Jin Sasaki. But Haney countered Norman's left hook with a peach of a check left hook of his own to have him on wobbly legs, and he then pierced through the guard of Norman with a right hand to score that second round knockdown. And with that unanimous decision victory over Norman, Haney picked up the WBO welterweight world title, making Haney an undefeated 3-weight world champion. He moved up and beat the A champion of the welterweight division to do so. And by the way, I've had Haney in this fight all through the build-up. I stated this on a community post at the start of fight week, and I did have money locked in on him a while before that. Now, you could very well say that Devin Haney beat a guy in Brian Norman Jr. that he really ought to have been beaten anyway. A guy who he has way more world championship experience than. A kid who's never beaten a world champion but got that WBO strap thanks to the strings that Top Rank pull in order to get their fighters a world title before they're proven. You could also say that the fight wasn't very entertaining outside of that excitement in round 2 when Haney had Norman hurt. And Haney just sort of steadily outboxed Norman and coasted to victory in boring fashion and just didn't push the action again after having Norman so hurt. And you could say that Haney winning a world title in his first fight at 147 against a career welterweight isn't awfully impressive in the way of jumping up in weight, given how massive Devin Haney was at 135 and 140. Haney does really look like a natural welterweight anyway. And other than the fact that this win over Norman is Haney's first win against a younger fighter who was favoured to beat him, which is a great addition to his resume, I'd be inclined to agree with those talking points about this being a fairly standard win for Haney for the most part. But all of that stuff about the Haney win being expected is not what all of these industry guys were saying in the lead up to the fight, were they? Norman is too dangerous, too powerful, and Haney is a shot fighter now, ain't he? The assassin Brian Norman Jr. was meant to poleaxe Devin Haney according to a lot of these guys. And you know what? I really don't begrudge all of the people who mindlessly hyped up Brian Norman Jr. beyond belief and belligerently disrespected Devin Haney since this fight got made, because that allowed rational thinkers to get Devin Haney as a slight underdog with the bookies and win a nice bit of change. And despite the aforementioned factors about this win kind of being a given for Devin Haney all things considered, it was all of those over-the-top media narratives from people with an agenda going into the fight that made the victory over Brian Norman Jr. such a satisfying comeuppance for Devin Haney. And don't get me wrong, defeating an undefeated dangerous guy like that and dropping him in the process deserves a lot of credit either way. This ain't just a big win because Haney shut up all the doubters and shut down the overly inflated Brian Norman Jr. hype. All of the pressure was meant to be on the more proven and world-renowned Devin Haney going into this fight, you know, after how he got beat up in the Ryan Garcia fight, and with the year of inactivity that he had after that fight, and with the stinker that he put on against Ramirez in the comeback fight. But by the time of this fight, most of the pressure was actually on Brian Norman Jr., which showed in his walkout. I am a big fan of Brian Norman Jr. myself, but I reckon a lot of people's love for Brian Norman Jr. in the build-up to this particular fight was motivated by some form of agenda, whether it be an agenda against Devin Haney or whatever. And it's all good rooting for Brian Norman Jr., but to use emotions and hope to break the fight down as if Brian Norman Jr. is the one very likely to win is an example of how easily narratives get created in boxing. Somebody with a voice has an agenda, and the masses latch onto it. You know, I'm starting to think that guys with big platforms get paid off by bookies to spin narratives about a certain guy winning so all of their fans can place losing bets. Because in reality, Norman is so unproven and should not be a lock against a Devin Haney. But from what I can tell, most people are backing Norman due to certain narratives accentuated by certain voices in the media, on the YouTube, so the average boxing fan was donating money to the bookies when it came to this Haney versus Norman fight. And remember, a lot of these big content creators have sponsorships with the bookies. I'm telling you, there were so many predictions for this fight that didn't seem genuine. The aim seemed to be to spin a narrative for some ulterior motive. It's all greaseball shit. And even if people want to say now that Haney stunk the place out and fought scared for the whole fight against Norman apart from in that second round, well, before the fight, a lot of people are saying that if Haney tried to stink the place out and run away from Norman the way he did against Ramirez, then Norman will just catch up to Haney and knock him out anyway. Haney won't be able to escape. I mean, from what I know, one guy who was doing hours and hours of pre-fight content for that fight was banging on and on about that. Look, Norman Jr. is a fun fighter, but his biggest win is over Giovanni Santillan. And as great as that win was, beautiful violence from Norman Jr. there. He did not have to go finding Santillan at all, trust me. Any opportunity to throw power shots were pretty much given to him. And the same goes for Norman's second biggest career win over Jin Sasaki. Jose Ramirez is a former unified world champ who's beaten multiple world champions using a pressure style of fighting, and Norman has beaten no world champions. So if Ramirez couldn't get anything going against the cagey Devin Haney, then why were they so sure that Norman could? Oh, and the voices that dominate the space also failed to remind you that Brian Norman Jr. got dropped hard by Boca Chica in the fight before he beat Santillan. Look, Haney was just nicking a lot of the rounds against Norman in there, but the onus was on Norman to push the action, and he was tipped to be able to push the action effectively, hence why he was the favourite. But he just didn't do enough a lot of the time, and he found himself smothering his own work at times and allowing Haney to tie him up. I think getting knocked down like that in the second round did make Norman much more tentative for the rest of the fight. Now, a lot of the agendas favouring Norman going into this fight were based around Norman Jr. being a likeable guy, and he definitely is a likeable guy. But in terms of that pressure shift before the fight, you know how all the pressure somehow ended up being on Norman, it's almost like people are propping Norman up to be this saviour of boxing because he's this gritty guy from the south who's no nonsense. You know, a real throwback fighter. And people are really marking out over that video of him saying how he don't care about fashion and all of that. And trust me, I'm of Brian Norman Jr.'s school of thought when it comes to that type of stuff myself. But all of those factors about Brian Norman Jr. being a likeable, down-to-earth guy with a fun, broadened style in the ring doesn't at all take away from the fact that Devin Haney is too fast, too sharp, too experienced. Didn't that fat guy who asked a tranny to shit on his chest and peg him or ever do a video saying that he hates Devin Haney, and he started spinning all these narratives to try and amplify the Devin Haney hate? I'd say I'm glad that he got backlash for that in the comments, but then again, that's another person who doesn't really care about boxing successfully using our sport for engagement bait. Again, I am a big fan of Brian Norman Jr., and I hope that everyone still rocks with him as much now after the loss to Haney as they were in the build up to the fight. I know I will. I'll continue to talk about Brian Norman Jr. whoever he fights next, but unfortunately there are just a bunch of Devin Haney haters who are loving off Brian Norman Jr. in the build up to the Haney fight, but won't give a flying fuck about being Norm going forward. One person who's really been left with their dick in their hand after this result is Brian Norman Sr. And Devin Haney did call it on Ariel Helwani's show weeks before the fight. He said that with all the talk that Norman Sr. has been doing, when he beats his son, he'll be standing there with his dick in his hand.
It'd be fucking standing there with his dick in his hand.
Yeah. People think Bill Haney is annoying, but I'd say that Brian Norman Sr. is the more annoying of the two dads. I don't mind Bill. I know he's a bit over the top, but that's the whole point. He's got that sort of over the top wrestling heel manager stick to where I don't even take him seriously enough to dislike him. But trust me, if you listen to enough of Brian Norman Sr., oh, and he's live on Mill City Boxing going on and on for hours every day, you'd grow tired of him pretty quickly, trust me, unless you had some sort of personal affinity with him for certain reasons. There's got to literally be dozens and dozens of hours worth of content of him talking about how his son's going to knock Devin Haney out on Mill City. Shout out to Mill City, by the way, great interviews on there. And one of the funniest things in the build up to this Haney versus Norman fight, well, it was funny for me at least because I was almost certain that Haney would win, was when Norman Sr. was getting rage baited by Greg Hackett, saying that Devin Haney is too fast, too sharp, too experienced.
But you said that it was going to be a 50-50 fight.
Devin Haney is too sharp, too fast, too experienced.
So it's not a 50-50?
Fuck no.
So what you going to say when we cook it?
You're not.
Okay, so when we do, what you going to say?
Devin Haney is too fast.
All right,
too
all right.
sharp.
So let me try to get you to understand. Let's do what you niggas don't want to do. Watch this. Okay, so this is a better opponent than your guy that you come on defending. This is a better opponent he's ever faced in his life. So my question
Devin
to
Haney
you
is too fast, too
right,
sharp.
all of that. So my question to you is, if we cook him, if we knock him the fuck out, and we knock him out in a better fashion, in a quicker fashion than we did Jen Sasaki, what does that say about Brian Norman Jr.? Don't move the needle. Don't even put it out there.
Devin Haney is too sharp, too
You're
fast.
not going to answer what it means? Are you going to answer what it means?
I did. I just answered it.
No. Are you going to answer what it means that Brian Norman knocked him the fuck out?
Devin Haney is too sharp, too fast.
That's how
too
you do it. That's why I don't even like talk to this
What
nigga.
about, what about?
Yeah, that is Greg Hackett's line, by the way, for those of you who don't know, but I repeat it so much myself because it was so true about this fight.
Say it with me now. Devin Haney is too fast, too sharp, too experienced.
And yet Haney saying that Norman Sr. would be left standing there with his dick in his hand was gold as well. Trust me, O.M.E. Boxing ain't no Devin Haney fanboy, nor am I a Brian Norman Jr. hater. But the build up to this particular fight has to be some of the most insane shit I've ever seen. I'm just a boxing fan, but as a boxing fan, I could objectively recognise how nuts the disrespect on Devin Haney was, and more importantly, how underestimated he was going into this fight, and how obscene it was that this large contingency of temporary Brian Norman Jr. fans was formed in the build up to this fight. It is amusing when things like this happen in combat sports, with fan narratives and stuff. We saw something kind of similar earlier in the year in the UFC with the O.M.E versus Buckley fight, but nah, this Haney-Norman stuff was way more mad. And don't you love how, when the camera went to Conor Benn in the crowd, he was leaning on Eddie Hearn, trying to be funny, acting like he was falling asleep during the Haney fight, as if to say that the fight is boring, but he was really just sat there with his dick in his hand, looking like a fanoik, while a fighter who is levels above him was on his way to becoming a free-weight world champion. A level of greatness that Conor Benn will never achieve. Man, DAZN are embarrassing for having Conor Benn and Eddie Hearn on air just trashing Devin Haney right after Haney became a free-weight world champion. That was a disgrace. Look, as much as Conor Benn is nowhere near Haney's level, he is a fighter given bravado and trash talking a potential opponent in all fairness. But Eddie Hearn's a petty little bitch for the way he was acting there. DAZN and Ring Magazine and Riyadh Season just control all the narratives though, don't they? I know Brian Norman Jr. ain't a DAZN fighter, but if the DAZN affiliated voices want to carry on some agenda against Devin Haney and do damage control by calling that fight boring now that he won, they'll go on and on spinning the narratives for weeks to come, watch. Stuff like this is why I did that whole rant about DAZN and their narrative control in my last video. It's worth the listen, links at the top of the description. I know this is my first video in like a month and it's just some little post-fight reaction that's mainly focused around what the pre-fight narratives were going into this fight, but as those of you who follow my community posts will know, I've been chipping away working tirelessly on one massive video that will probably end up being over 3 hours long. So as much as I found the time to keep up with a good bit of the pre-fight content for this Haney vs Norman fight while I've been grinding out the big project, I didn't want to put the big video aside at any point to be reacting to other people's predictions for the fight and all that on my channel. I know one poxy community post isn't enough for me to start gloating about the Haney win saying I told you so, but that's all there was to say. Devin Haney is too fast, too sharp, too experienced. And now that the fight has happened, I thought I'd take the time to give a little roundup about all the pre-fight narratives in one video and sort of look at how damage control is being done after the fight now. And don't worry, yes, I know some people had good pragmatic reasons to pick Brian Norman Jr. in this fight that were totally rational. I'm not saying that there was anything wrong with picking Norman. We all get picks wrong, trust me, I know. But I just feel like there were some extreme narratives about this fight coming from a lot of people that had nothing to do with fight analysis. Now, I've got a video that I want to do about Anthony Yarde's career in reaction to his loss to Benavidez in the main event, but it's a unique video that would still be relevant at any time and it won't be a short one, so I might just have to leave that one for the future. The only other video I'm probably going to do before I post my big video, the big video which may not be up until like mid-January at this point due to other commitments outside of YouTube, is a reaction video to the Fraser Clark vs Jamie TKV fight this weekend. And the big documentary I'm working on is actually relevant to that Clark vs TKV fight, so I'll announce what the big video is going to be in my reaction video to that fight. I'll touch on a couple of other things in that video too. As for what's next for Devin Haney, the welterweight division is just for the taking. Haney can easily become undisputed. The other 3 champs in the division are Lewis Crocker, the IBF champ, Rolly Romero, the WBA champ, and Mario Barrios, the WBC champion, who's meant to be defending his title against Ryan Garcia next up. And to prove that I backed Haney to beat anyone at 147 before his fight with the then WBO champ Brian Norman Jr. was even made official, in that undisputed video I did back in June, I picked Haney as the fighter most likely to become undisputed at welterweight next if anyone were to unify the division. A lot of things I said in that video aged tremendously in fact, but I don't do the whole I told you so shtick. I keep it humble and let people call me cursed and all of that. I know the welterweight division is very weak now, which I analysed in detail in a video back in May, but the amount of people who'd predict Devin Haney to clean up at 147 after the Norman win now is surely a much larger amount of people than the amount of people that would have predicted this before. As much as I am all about unifications, personally, the fight I want to see next is Devin Haney versus the #1 contender for his newly won WBO belt, Jack Boots Catterall. Yes, that's what I'm calling Catterall now, after the way he demolished Echo Esserman in his first fight under the Bozy Ennis camp. Funnily enough, in my last video, in reference to Jack Catterall leaving the Jamie Moore camp, I said that with how boring Jack Catterall usually is, if he beats Echo Esserman up Philly style in his first fight under Bozy, then that's a bad look for the camp of Jamie Moore and Nigel Travis. But when I actually saw the new Jack Catterall, I was more so seeing it from the perspective of, wow man, that Philly shit is real. A guy from Chorley up in northern England just randomly moved across the pond to Philadelphia the other month, and now he's a whole new fighter. I've spoken about Jack Catterall a lot on my channel in the past, and I've always rated him as a high level fighter, but I've always pointed out how boring he is. But now that he's Boots Catterall, I find it easier to support him. It's funny because Echo Esserman said before the fight that the Ennis camp can't turn Catterall into Boots, but look how he ended up. Now, Haney Catterall is the highest level fight to be made in the welterweight division despite it not being a unification. It's just the WBO champion versus the WBO #1 contender, which is a testament to how good the WBO are as a sanctioning body when they're not being used as a toy by Top Rank or Queensberry. When Teofimo Lopez defended his WBO super lightweight title against the WBO mandatory Arnold Barboza earlier in the year, for instance, Barboza who became mandatory by defeating Jack Catterall funnily enough, that was on paper the highest level fight in the division at the time, given that Barboza was the undefeated long-time #1 contender who arguably had a better resume than any of the other champions at 140 at the time. And the same thing applies across the weight classes. When Tyson Fury beat Vladimir Klitschko for the unified world heavyweight titles in 2015, and when Alexander Usyk beat Anthony Joshua for the unified heavyweight titles in 2021, they both challenged for the unified world titles as the WBO mandatory. Anyway, back on track. Yeah, I just think Haney Catterall is the fight to make simply because of levels. Ryan Garcia is about to fight Mario Barrios for the WBC title, so if Haney beat Catterall and Ryan Garcia beat Barrios, we could finally get Haney versus Garcia too. This time as a WBC and WBO welterweight world title unification. Unifications with Rolly Romero or Luis Crocker, or whoever ends up holding the WBA and IBF belts, could come later down the line for Haney. Or maybe we get Garcia versus Romero too in a WBC and WBA unification if Ryan Garcia beats Barrios. As for the potential of Devin Haney fighting Conor Benn, that fight would not be close. Haney takes Conor Benn to school. 6 periods, no lunch break, and a 2-hour detention. And I'd be sat there with my cup of tea, just like I would for the Norman fight, enjoying the schooling that Haney would give to Benn. Haney would box his ears off. Jab is nothing. He is too fast, too sharp, too experienced. I kind of have no interest in the Devin Haney-Conor Benn fight because of how much of a mismatch it would be. But to be fair, if they really want to do that fight, it could work for me. In a perfect world, Haney defends the WBO against Catterall, Garcia wins the WBC from Barrios, Benn wins the IBF from Crocker, Garcia unifies his WBC title with Romero's WBA title in a rematch, and then Devin Haney does a WBO and IBF unification with Conor Benn, thus finally setting up Haney versus Garcia 2, this time for the undisputed welterweight world title. But we all know it's never that smooth sailing in boxing. As for what's next for B Norm, I think what's best for him is a good challenge that he can win. I'll be honest, I'm not too fussed to ponder on who that should be at this very point in time, but I'll tell you who his next opponent definitely shouldn't be, and that's Jack Boots Catterall. From what I can tell, nobody really dislikes Norman Jr. as a fighter or as a guy at all, and rightly so, but he has a lot of detractors who would consider him a bit too overhyped and would lambast him and his father for ducking the Boots Ennis fight and fighting Derek Cuevas on a woman's undercard instead. Look, that's all good not fighting Boots at that very moment in time. Norman wasn't ready for Boots. I know he was a world champion already at the time when he was made the offer to fight Boots by Boots' promoter Eddie Hearn, and you should be ready to fight anyone as a world champion. But you guys know the deal. A young top-ranked prospect gets a WBO world title belt before their world championship caliber. But now, it's the way Norman Sr. goes on and on and on and on about Boots Ennis that has created some level of hostility towards the Normans by a section of boxing fans. And with the upset defeat to Haney, criticisms of Norman Jr. will now be amplified. And due to Brian Norman Sr.'s obsession with the Ennis camp, he started lambasting Jack Catterall's performance against Echo Esserman, despite admitting to the fact that he'd never seen Jack Catterall fight before that Esserman fight. So is it a coincidence that Norman Sr. randomly has all of this stuff to say about Catterall now that Catterall's with Bozy? No. And as much as I'd probably pick Brian Norman Jr. to beat a lot of the welterweights out there, probably even any of the 3 world champs that aren't called Devin Haney, I would most certainly pick Jack Catterall to beat Brian Norman Jr. And if Norman lost to Jack Catterall, who's under the guidance of Bozy Ennis, right after the loss to Haney, the Normans will get cooked. And I don't want that for Norman Jr. So yeah, you know what? I want Brian Norman Jr. to fight any welterweight next after the loss to Haney. I'd even be happy to see him get a shot at any of the other world champs coming off of the loss. But just don't go near Catterall. A loss to Catterall would be bad for the Norman brand. Boy, would Senior really be stood there with his dick in his hand then, running his mouth on stream all the time while Bozy's just in the gym not saying too much, and then one of Bozy's fighters just schools his son. It would be rather diabolical, not gonna lie. Anyway, you guys let me know what you think in the comments down below. Can I just say again that Eddie Hearn is an absolute muppet, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.